As I said to Peter, this was not my choice of a title. My initial proposal did not clear editing with the forum. So if it's a little academic, that's by their design, not mine. And I'll tell you that this, and that's not a complaint, that's just a fact about what happened. This talk is partly a practical workshop in what I have found to be effective over the past 2 decades in discussing intelligent design and naturalism or materialism in front of academic audiences and lay audiences. There are a range of ways of attacking this question that put people to sleep. Now, I may do that this afternoon, given the hour, and it's a long afternoon, but what I'm going to show you are metaphors, analogies, and structures of arguments that I have found work with audiences, even audiences of hard-bitten skeptics and atheists, who are dead set against the possibility of there being any kind of design in the universe. So let me just begin with a little fable. The fable has 2 main characters, Teleo and Physic, and they share a workshop. And for a long time, they worked together amicably, no problems. They worked for a king, making artifacts for him. But then Physic decided that he was going to change the way the workshop operated. And he told Teleo, everything has to be built from the bottom up, 1 layer at a time, no blueprints or plans allowed. Right, now, his name is a hint, obviously. This is physicalist reductionism, which today I think you will find among the most vocal proponents of materialism is their preferred worldview for explanation. The ultimate layer of reality, particles in motion, if you will, really constitutes all that there is ultimately. So proper causal explanation should begin at that fundamental layer and build up 1 layer at a time. So along these pathways, we would have the formation of galaxies and planets, eventually life, the complexity representing animals accretes, and at some point along this long trajectory of bottom-up causation, Homo sapiens, with all of our characteristics, appears on the scene. So that's what physics says, and he lays it down as a rule. Now, Teleo is unpersuaded, because Teleo knows that blueprints and plans are essential for making anything in the shop. If you're going to make anything that actually works, that is. So here's a plan, and Teleo says, look, that's how we get to our goal when we're building anything. And we don't have to work bottom up. We can work from every relevant direction. No layer of reality in the shop can be privileged over any other. Only the outcome, only the product matters. And they're at loggerheads. But Physic is stronger. At a particular moment in history, he is stronger. He has great influence with the king, to whom he complains. And he said, look, Teleo's tools and plans should not be allowed, and the king lets Physic have his way. So, goodbye to intelligent design. Well, maybe not. Physics tells myths about Teleo, and those myths can be answered decisively. So here are 3 pervasive myths about intelligent design, which actually may have some currency even here at the forum. I know when I lecture at Christian colleges, and I'll name them, I won't be bashful, Calvin, Wheaton, Christian colleges of that stature, most of the science faculty who have to sign statements of confessions of faith to serve on the faculty, most of the science faculty strongly rejects intelligent design for one or another of the reasons I'm about to articulate. So these myths are pervasive, not just in the secular community, but among Christians as well. The first is that intelligent design is simply creationism renamed, relabeled for the 21st century. The second is probably the most powerful, and that is that science does not need and cannot use the notion of intelligence in genuine causal explanation. That this term can only be a placeholder for a more fundamental physics-based bottom-up explanation, whatever that happens to be. So intelligence simply holds a place until a proper physical explanation comes along. Lastly, intelligent design is God of the gaps reasoning and therefore intrinsically vulnerable to refutation. Actually, this particular myth is widely held by Christians who work in the sciences. So a few years ago when ELF was meeting in Chopin, I had a mini debate with Ard Louis, some of you may know. And recently I was on Moody Radio for an hour with Ard. He was calling in from Oxford, and I was there in the Chicago studio. And this was one of the main points that Ard made. Those of you who don't know him, Ard Louis is a Christian who works in biophysics and actually works very much in evolutionary puzzles like the origin of life, is a Christian but strongly rejects intelligent design largely for this reason, this third reason. So let's evaluate these myths one after the next, and we'll spend the most time on this one because this is really where I think the action is. And this second point is where you can gain the most traction with skeptics and atheists because of the reality of their own experience. So we'll spend the most time on the second one. But we can dispense with this one very quickly. So here's the complaint. It's a can of soup in the conceptual soup aisle. And it's just, a relabeling trick. Creationism wasn't selling very, very well, so let's call it intelligent design. And we maybe move a few more cans of the product, but really nobody is fooled. It's the same stuff when you take the top of the can off. Now this is widely held by people who don't think very deeply about the question and who certainly don't know any history. But here's a distinction that we'll use throughout the talk that you can get a lot of mileage from. Take it from me. And here's another piece of advice. Do not contrast natural with supernatural. The longer I have been in this debate as a philosopher of science and a wannabe biologist, the less happy I am with the adjective supernatural. And I would love to look at and I believe in miracles. At the wedding at Cana, there were 180 gallons of a very fine vintage that appeared from water. There was very little carbon in those vessels before Jesus gave his directions. Afterwards, there was a lot of exquisite carbon in those vessels, all right? We don't have a physical pathway to describe that. I believe in miracles and their reality, so I'm not maligning the reality of the miraculous. What I'm saying is, for the intelligent design debate, the adjective supernatural is a mischief maker and puts many more obstacles in your way than need to be there. Whereas this distinction between natural and intelligent is robust, there's a clean analytical cut here, and you won't shut down someone's brain when you say supernatural and they say, well, that's spooks and goblins and I can't talk about it, so the discussion is over. In any case, we'll use this distinction. We'll come back to it. I wanted to throw it up there. We can go 45 years before the birth of Christ in Cicero's great work on the nature of the gods and find an exquisite representation of the intelligent design debate, not a Christian in sight. No sacred text in sight. What's the issue? The issue is one familiar to Greek philosophy for hundreds of years, up until the point where Cicero writes this. In fact, he uses a familiar trope, metaphor from intelligent design literature, popular literature, taking the pieces of the game Scrabble. I don't know if is there an equivalent in German?
We call it Scrabble. That's just the word we use for it.
Oh, you crazy, crazy German. Now I'm embarrassed. I feel embarrassed. In any case, you know the metaphor. You've got all the pieces and you shake them and throw them out on the ground. And Cicero asks, would you spell a single line from Ennius or even a single word? Chances are no, because of randomness as a causal process does not locate specific targets. There's a vast or vast space of nonsense it's likely to produce. In any case, the debate is recognizably the one that we have today, but there's no sacred text to which appeals are made for authority. In fact, our familiar religious context is really not there at all. And I've been struck as I've gone back into ancient philosophy to see the prevalence of this debate. And we have Socrates and Plato on the side of design. We have Democritus and Epicurus on the side of naturalism or materialism. So the issues are being joined at that level. And in fact, David Sedley at Cambridge, in a wonderful book that I recommend to you, called Creationism and Its Critics in Antiquity, published by University of California in 2008. In the introduction, he says, I'm going to talk about this debate as it lived in ancient Greek philosophy, and really there should be a little parenthesis here. To my American readers, don't worry about the Bible. Don't worry about the authority of sacred text, because that was simply not relevant in the ancient setting that I'm going to be discussing. Appeals were made for and against divine creation, meaning in this context, of course, intelligent design, and its explanatory power by leading philosophers, but the cultural context familiar, especially to people in North America, of interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11 and the age of the earth and so forth, simply not relevant. In fact, you can build a strong case as you go out from even the Abrahamic religions and Greek philosophy out throughout world cultures. You can find debates about mind versus physics or natural processes that really transcend any particular religion or culture, meaning that this myth is simply false historically, both historically and, in fact, descriptively. So humans have used concepts like mind, intelligence, and agency as long as we've been around, because they do explanatory work for us, and they happen to be true. They happen to be true causal explanations. So we can dispense with that first one. Now we come to one that's a little more meaty, a little more significant. And that is that natural science cannot use the notion of intelligence and causal explanation. It's simply a placeholder. So we go back to Physic and Teleo, and Physic puts a rule in the workshop, a big sign with a long philosophical name. There it is. Now, I took this from a book published by the National Academy in the late 90s because the National Academy in the US was concerned that too many Americans, typically about 7 out of 10 Americans, reject Darwinian evolution for one reason or another. And in that book, and I think you can download it off the web, it's like 200 pages, big PDF. There's a section on the philosophy of science where they have this very clear, short formulation of methodological naturalism that I think is really the best, because this verb is an imperative. It says you don't have a choice. This is not a rule of thumb. This is not a suggestion. This is what I used to say to my teenage daughters when they wanted to go to the mall before they had done their homework, right? They didn't have a choice. And then here we have this logical modifier, only, saying, when you open the lid on your box of possible causes, this is what you will find, and that's all that you will find. So we go back to our taxonomy of possible causes here, and what happens is intelligence is taken out, and that becomes the whole of your toolkit, where natural causes are going to do all the real work. But the fact is, we don't actually reason this way. All right, so let's dissolve away the agent on the lower level. And again, practical workshop. This distinction I have found very powerful with skeptics, because in their daily life, let's forget about science for a moment and philosophy. Simply in their daily life, they make and use this distinction all the time, and they place great weight on it. In a way that doesn't really require philosophical analysis. It simply reflects the reality that their cognitive apparatus regularly distinguishes effects that have a natural or material cause from those that require an agent. And they don't collapse this into this. In fact, I say, imagine that you're being asked to serve on a criminal jury, and it's a capital case. It's a really serious crime, a murder, let's say. And I say, you're serving on the jury, and the defense attorney manages to persuade you that the accused had a brain tumor that affected his ability to control his actions, that the centers of his brain involved in voluntary control were severely damaged by this brain tumor. In a case like that, if the medical evidence is compelling, what's happening is physics is making a better, or providing a better explanation causally than a freely acting intelligence. And in a case like that, what you're going to say is, I'm likely to find him innocent. In fact, this happens with some regularity. People are absolved of guilt or moral responsibility, depending on their free choice, because there is an adequate physical cause for the event in question. And normally, in that sort of situation, which, again, does not involve science or philosophy, but simply basic reasoning, this notion is not collapsed into this one, because if you do that, you take away its explanatory uniqueness and power. So here's another very homespun way of thinking about this. I say, imagine that you are in the audience at a television game show. And behind this door are an array of puzzles. You haven't seen them yet, but you win the game show by solving the puzzle, and you're given a choice. Okay, you can have box 1, and in box 1 are hundreds of solutions of type X. They're all of a certain type. I'll say what it is in a moment. So you can have box 1, or you can have box 2. Now, the great thing about box 2 is if there's a type X solution in box 1, you get it. Whoops, sorry about that. Big jump there. I don't know what happened, but I just jumped through my slide sequence. Try to watch what I touch here. Oh, it did. I apologize. Hang on, guys. No, we need a category for stupidity.
Just it's only misguided intelligence.
No, it is. It is stupidity. It's when you lean on the touchpad on the MacBook. That's what. So keep this hand away. All right. So box 1. Now, box 2 is great because if there's a type X solution in box 1, you get it in box 2. So you're not losing anything at that level. Any explanatory concept, cause, mechanism that you have here in 1 is present in 2, but you also get the type Y solutions. Now, for an atheist audience or a skeptical audience when I present this, no one takes box 1. Given this description, the rational choice is go for more explanatory power because you don't know what could be behind that door. I haven't introduced anything about God's existence. I haven't even talked about mind or intelligence. I've just said, which one are you going to take? Everybody goes for this because you don't know what could be behind there and you want a greater range of options. All right, so let's say the type X solutions are physics-based. They're bottom-up. And these are the ones that involve a mind or intelligence. And let's say that's our first puzzle. Anybody recognize it? It's quartz. You can grow it. I can give you the recipe for quartz. Get those ions in the right ratio in solution, and you can grow great big vats of these. In fact, watch manufacturers do that with some regularity. Now, if you know what this next one is, don't say. I see the geologists nodding. When these were first discovered, there was a decades-long debate about their causal etiology, natural or artificial. And I've put the question to audiences, who thinks they're natural? And usually about half the audience raises their hands. And I get a significant number of people saying, no, they're obviously artificial. They look like beautiful little glassy buttons turned or shaped on a lathe or molded in some way. They're tektites. And currently, the best explanation for their existence is, again, physics-based. You have a meteoritic impact that throws off molten globules. As they fall through the air, they cool. So here's our globule falling. The air comes up, pressing against the bottom. You get that beveling. The whole thing cools, falls to the ground, and you get that beautiful glassy button. But you couldn't even have the debate that actually occurred in geology unless intelligence was a live causal possibility. How about that? Okay, last year my wife and I were in central Mexico and we were visiting a pre-Columbian site, We're walking with an archaeologist up the path towards this temple. It was an awful place. There was all kinds of evidence of human sacrifice occurring there. But in any case, we're walking along, and the archaeologist reaches out and he grabs my arm and he says, "Paul, do you realize what you just stepped over?" I said, "I don't know, it looks to me like pebbles on a path." And he reaches down and picks up a beautiful little piece of pre-Columbian pottery that his perception is trained to detect and mine is not. But clearly, once I saw it close up, there it was. So this is a hand axe. If I gave it to you, it would balance nicely in your hand. There's a beveled cutting edge here along the side. And you find this in a site with no other evidence of intelligent habitation, you have evidence of an intelligent cause, at least one. All right, in this case, doesn't matter, don't do that. That really is artificial stupidity. I apologize, guys, one sec here. In this case, physics is clearly not going to work. Whatever your worldview, you're going to need intelligence to explain the real existence of that object, and here it's just not even a contest. Pigment does not arrange itself on board like that without the genius of Leonardo, okay? So, I say to my skeptical audience, this is a good toolkit to have, whatever your worldview happens to be, because there are causes like this that bring about effects that require their existence. Now, there's an aphorism from Einstein that apparently he never actually said. This is the bumper sticker version of the aphorism. This is what he said in a lecture at Oxford that amplifies on this point. This is what you could fit on a bumper sticker, but this is what he says that really, to me, captures the nature of scientific explanation with respect to the epistemic value of parsimony. Theories should be as parsimonious as possible, but not a whit more than is needed to deal with the world. We do not want to sacrifice any part of reality for the sake of elegance or parsimony in our theories. So if reality is complicated, our theories should be as complicated as they need to be to explain what's there. Or as one of my advisors at Chicago put it, don't hold a desert ontology if you live in a tropical rainforest. And ontology and epistemology are very closely related. If souls are real, and souls are causally efficacious in the world, then souls belong in the toolkit of science, whether you like them or not, right? So here's a desert ontology. Clean, easy to remember, and totally sterile, okay, if this is where you live. Sand and air, and there's some little critter that made that path. That's easy to remember. One thing about a physical ontology, although I can't really say that I believe this when I look at the zoo of particles and subparticles and everything else that fundamental physics is finding. But let's just say we've got a simple physical ontology. That's what we say is reality, and then we have to explain this. Or something more complicated. You do not want your theories to be simpler than reality itself. For my thesis for this afternoon is science, natural science, loses nothing by allowing for the possibility of design. In fact, it gains tremendously. But it loses a tool it cannot retrieve if it excludes design. If intelligence is irreducible to physics, then eliminating it from the toolkit of science damages your ability to explain. And that's where the fundamental asymmetry in my title comes from. You lose nothing by allowing for the possibility, but if you exclude it, you can't get it back. So we can draw a moral from these puzzles. You've heard of Occam's razor. I want to introduce you to Leibniz's toolbox. There he is, one of my philosophical heroes. And there's his toolbox, right out of Google Images. Entities should not be discarded if keeping them costs you nothing. Okay? So I have tools at home. This is really true. I have tools at home in my garage, and I don't remember what they're for. And my wife is ruthless. She periodically sweeps through the house. We haven't touched this in a year. Out it goes. Off to Goodwill. Off to Salvation Army with it. And she looks at the garage. That's basically my territory. And I know she wants to go through there and throw things away. I don't let her, because I know if she throws away one of those tools, the next week I'll remember what it's for, and I won't have it anymore. So, what's the corollary for scientific explanation? Don't throw away a cause you might need, especially if you have to sneak it back later anyway, which happens all the time with people like Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, the new atheists. They dispense with moral categories, let's say, and then they find they have to serve on a jury. Or then they find someone has stolen their iPad. Or, then they find they need these basic categories to do explanatory work for them, but because of their desire for a nice, clean, easy to remember physicalist ontology, they've tossed them away and they sneak them back when no one's looking. Reintroduce this into their toolkit because they find they can't understand the world without it. What's interesting is the integrity of natural science itself depends on our ability to make this kind of move, to do this kind of detection. So here's a real-life example. A tragedy, really. J. Hendrik Schoen was a young physicist at Bell Labs who was on his way to a Nobel Prize in solid-state physics. And he had a string of high-profile papers in journals like Nature and Science. There's a wonderful book about this published just a couple of years ago called Fantastic Plastic that lays out the whole sad story. So here he is. And this is an article from the New York Times. The University of Konstanz in Germany retracted his PhD in physics because his crime against science was so grave. So here's the problem. He had these high-profile results that were really interesting and exciting, and potentially billions of dollars in technology outcomes depended on them. So there was a lot at stake. But no one could replicate his findings. And this became so troubling that Bell Labs formed an investigative committee, and they began to look at his papers, not singly, but together. So they compared his papers one to another. And when they did, they noticed something very suspicious. So here's a figure from the Times article. It's perhaps a little hard to see. But they've taken two diagrams, one from a paper in the journal Science in November 2000, another from Applied Physics Letters in December of the same year. And you'll notice that these curves are largely identical. I mean, there's one of them is, this one is missing from this one. But the noise is exactly the same. So the Times has taken this portion of this curve and the same portion from this curve and blown them up. And you can superimpose those lines on each other. If I gave you a blank sheet of paper and asked you to sign your name 5 times, you could do it right over there, and I didn't tell you why, there would be more variation in your signatures than in these 2 lines. Even though your signature uniquely identifies you, I mean, you're a complex nonlinear system and you output this particular pattern, banks use it, the government uses it to identify you. When the investigative committee saw this match, his career was over. And you can download their report off the web. It's very, very long. They go through all of his publications. And they point out that the reproduction of the noise has no known physical explanation. It shouldn't reproduce. Why is it there? It's there because he faked. By his deliberate intent, he faked those results. Now, who knows what the worldview happens to be of the people on this investigative committee, but what are they doing? They are sifting possible causes, physical causes, causes not involving a mind, and saying none of them are causally adequate for that pattern. For that pattern, we need an agent, a real cause that brings about an effect that we can observe in the universe that requires, for its true causal explanation, pointing back to him. That's the only way you can catch him. That's how we catch science fraud, because this doesn't work. If I make a genuine discovery, new physical process or mechanism, I don't need to be there for you to replicate it. I give you my methods and materials, you can replicate the result. This is the only adequate explanation for that. So the integrity of science itself depends on our ability to make this kind of move. Anybody recognize that? I guess we're going to talk a little bit about global warming here. It's the famous Keeling curve, where the rise of atmospheric CO2 over the past 50 years gives you this pattern with the sawtooth representing the increasing burning of carbon products over the course of a year. You couldn't even have the anthropogenic global warming debate if you were somehow forbidden to say this is the effect of creatures on this planet digging up carbon and burning it. It wouldn't happen if Homo sapiens wasn't running around pumping oil and digging up coal and putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere to heat their homes and power computers and so forth. So at the very heart of the anthropogenic global warming debate is the claim, whether true or not, but the claim is there, we can detect the action of intelligence in the atmosphere of this planet. And we can distinguish that from what would have happened if the intelligences were not present. So you can go through all the sciences and find that intelligence is being used. So my skeptic, remember I'm in this conversation with a skeptic, atheist or agnostic, they say, it's only human intelligent causation, which no one doubts. It's still Homo sapiens. So we can raise the temperature in the room, okay? Reach over and grab the thermostat and crank it around, warm things up, and here is the radio telescope at Arecibo, built into a natural depression there. There's Jill Tarter, who is the real-life model for the Jodie Foster character in the movie Contact. And it's 3 a.m., and this is my view of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. At 3 a.m., I would have been asleep for 5 hours, more or less. But it's interesting what she says in the caption to that photo. They're testing pattern detection software. Well, why? Why would it be obvious? You remember from geometry, it's the ratio between the circumference of a circle and its diameter, and there are the first 500 digits. And there are web pages where you can go and you can put your phone number in, and it'll tell you where your phone number is in the decimal expansion of pi. But you know what? In the US, we have the 7-digit plus the 3-digit area code. It's not big enough yet to have that 10-digit string. But sometime in our lifetime, as these crazy Russian mathematicians continue to make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more weird things will be in pi, like complete lines of poetry, which, if you think about it, will drive you absolutely bonkers. So don't meditate on pi, but you wouldn't need to see very much of this, and you would have reason to open the champagne. And that's, in fact, what Jill Tarter is hoping for. Really what she's hoping for is a narrow-band radio signal. That would be the primary indicator. But if she saw that, she could say, I've got evidence, and I'll never get out there to find them. I'll never get out to the other end of that signal to find them, but I have enough here to close my analytical pincers and say I've got design. Because mathematical objects like pi or prime numbers and so forth are produced by minds. And this is going to fail, and I've done what I wanted to do, which is to detect the presence of agency or intelligence. So what's in the toolkit of science? Here is a physical ontology from the 1st century Common Era, Aristotelian. Actually, you need the quintessence as well. And you know, people still flunked their physics exams. Earth, air, water. What's that fourth one? Can't remember. We come to the scientific revolution. This box of physical knowledge, of course, these are not to scale. This is getting much larger. We come up to the present. It's enormously large. We're learning more. As the prophet Daniel said, knowledge accumulates. Knowledge will grow. Knowledge is accumulating. Thank God for the way he set up our cognitive apparatus. Even though we work with false theories all the time, what we actually know does accumulate and grow. But let's put Stonehenge in here, okay? Yeah. At the time, 1st century Common Era, the island of Britain was becoming a colony of Rome. This was already thousands of years old at that point, as I understand the dating. So the Roman centurion who's coming over the hill there in the plain of Salisbury outside Bath, and he sees that, he makes this inference. It's true then. It's true at the scientific revolution. It's true today. It will be true when our current theories of physics, a fundamental layer of reality, are long gone. This kind of inference of intelligent design is among the most stable thing things that human beings know. With respect to scientific knowledge, inferences to intelligent causation are remarkably robust over time because the indicators of design are very strong, which means that as our box of physical knowledge gets bigger, if intelligence is irreducible to physics, as I believe is the case, it doesn't matter how big this gets. So we can just let it grow indefinitely. The power of intelligent design as a causal category will not go away. It can't. If it's irreducible to physics, this can get as large as you want. And if intelligence is a unique kind of cause that cannot be collapsed to physics, you cannot lose its explanatory power over time. And I think, in fact, the history of science shows this to be the case. All right, last myth. Intelligent design is just God of the gaps reasoning and intrinsically vulnerable. But this is, again, what I would put to a skeptic with whom I'm having a conversation. Not every question we put to nature will be answered in the terms that we prefer. And it's really the questions that matter. It's the questions that we put to nature that matter. So here's one. Little thought experiment. It's 20 years from now, I'm still alive. I'm at a retirement home, and I've got my 2035 equivalent of an iPhone, and I have a nephew working on Mars. Okay, there are tens of thousands of people up there. We've built labs, greenhouses, all kinds of facilities. They're happily exploring the planet. And I've got nothing else to do, so I want to talk to him. So here's my science question. My unsolved science problem. Remember, it's the questions that matter with the God of the Gaps objection. How can I communicate in real time with my nephew? I punch in his number, he picks it up, we have a nice conversation, I find out how things are going. Now, I can form this as an English or German or some other sentence, and you understand what I mean. You know what it is to have a real-time conversation. You know what these planets are. You understand this question. Is there an answer in the terms that I prefer? Of course, the answer is no. The question is ill-posed. We can ask it, right? You can ask it all you want, but given current physics, we're not going to get a reply. Nature's not going to oblige us. At its closest in the fall and autumn, it's about 35 million miles away. There's a speed limit. Do the math, it's going to be more than a 6-minute round trip. So I can put his number in, and then I can go make coffee, let the dog out, check my email, come back, and I'll hear him say hello. Nature doesn't work the way I want her to. And it doesn't matter how often or how sincerely I ask the question. If I'm putting a question to nature and not listening to her, I'm going to be frustrated. And the gap that I wish to fill in my knowledge will never be filled because the gap actually is out there in nature herself. Okay? So, questions like this persist as unsolved because they are predicated on erroneous assumptions. And in a case like that, the rational thing to do is to change your background theory. Don't keep asking a question for which you cannot supply an answer. And again, extra effort doesn't count. If your background assumptions are wrong, the rational course of action is to dissolve those assumptions, dissolve the problem, and try a different approach. So let's take these. The origin of life, the origin of functional complexity, the origin of animals. All three of these have resisted explanation in terms of Darwinian bottom-up explanation. I work on this one quite a bit, but I interact with people who work on both of these. And the questions being put are of the following form. How did the origin of life occur by a natural process? How did the animal body plans arise via natural selection? By the mechanism of selection operating on randomly arising variation and so forth. The questions determine the gaps to be filled, but if the questions are wrong, the gaps may not be there. The gaps, that is, in our understanding, and the discontinuities that we see in nature are aboriginal. They're the way nature was designed. Asking these questions with the modifier naturally doesn't reflect the evidence, I would say. What it reflects is the philosophy of naturalism, which has predetermined the acceptable answer. But if naturalism isn't true, these questions may not be answered as scientific community prefers. There are no gaps to be filled also. That last example, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. How am I doing on time, by the way? Good? Okay. Wonderful. Elliot Sober is a friend of mine. I first met as a graduate student, and we've interacted quite a bit. And he cites one of my papers frequently, which gives me incredible good feelings. And he's probably the best critic of intelligent design currently publishing in English. So if you go to his webpage at Wisconsin, he has a whole section of papers critiquing intelligent design thoughtfully. So he carefully evaluates the arguments on their merits. And if you're looking for a sparring partner or someone to challenge you about intelligent design, I can't recommend his work highly enough. It's really taught me a lot. When I was a student and undergraduate, I read something by Sober that really helped me, and it was a metaphor for finding causes in science. So I'm still an undergraduate when I read this, and he says, finding the cause in science is like knowing where the treasure is buried. Now, I really see this in my wife's work. She's a pediatric gastroenterologist at Northwestern University, and she'll come home at 6 o'clock. I do most of the cooking because of her schedule. So I'm getting dinner together, and I debrief her, right? And she'll come home clearly annoyed and frustrated because she has a patient, a child, who's very ill, but she can't identify the cause of the illness. In a situation like that, and I can remember clear, vivid examples of her coming through the door from the garage, and she's visibly agitated by not knowing what the cause is. In that situation, that child, that family, and my wife are at the mercy of that illness. Once the cause is identified, then they really do have the treasure in the sense of some hope of treatment, some hope of a plan, of not being at the mercy of nature, but actually gaining mastery over it. So I see this actually in really, I think of my wife as a scientist, not just a doctor. In all the working scientists I know, discovering the true cause really is like finding the treasure. And that suggests a helpful model. And I apologize if some of you have seen this before, but this, again, I have found tremendously useful in interacting with skeptical audiences because it appeals to their sense of freedom and curiosity. So here's an island, it's a conceptual island. And somewhere on this island is the answer to this puzzle, this scientific puzzle. Phenomenon X, we want to know its cause, okay? Now let's say we had a treasure map and the cause is down here, the southern tip of the island, and it happens to be intelligent design. In other words, a mind or an agent was involved in bringing X into existence. Not a strictly physical, material process, but an intelligence with its unique causal properties. Now, of course, you don't have treasure maps in science. If you did, there'd be no point. You have to search. But what's the practical consequence of this rule for our search? What's the practical consequence of this rule for our intellectual freedom? That really strikes home, even in a postmodern age. If you tell a student or a postdoc that I'm going to take away your freedom, they really don't like it. So if I can persuade them that this rule is taking away their freedom, they can forget about whether God exists or not. This rule is limiting their freedom as a curious human being to investigate the world. They really don't like that. For a good reason. The practical effect of that rule is to make a no-dig zone. You can't go down there. Before the evidence has a chance to speak for itself, before you actually begin searching, you have put the true cause out of reach. Not on the basis of the evidence, but on the basis of a philosophical dictum. Now, in that consequence, what's going to happen is you're going to dig fruitlessly. You may learn a lot, right? But you're never going to solve the puzzle. And if that's what you really care about, actually answering this question, you've made it impossible, even before you've begun to investigate. But notice, now this is the asymmetry. Notice what happens when we take away the no-dig zone. The whole island is still open for digging and exploration. So allowing for the possibility of design does not take away from anything else that we might find here. In theological terms, every physical regularity, every natural process, every mechanism that God built into this universe that's out there to be discovered will still be there to be discovered. You're not taking away any physical reality that is awaiting our elucidation by allowing for the possibility of design. The whole island is still open. What you've done is you've allowed for this possibility. That's an asymmetry that you can take to the bank, because what it means is allowing for the possibilities of design doesn't limit your freedom as a scientist, it gives you more. An open-ended science should be free to make that discovery if that's what actually happened. And this is where I say to an audience, don't cut off your own limbs. Don't damage your own intellectual freedom for the sake of a philosophy of science that belongs pushed off to the side of the road and not governing the way that you think. So, in the contest between teleo and physic, teleo can use every tool that physic brings into the workshop. But if physic is determined never to have a blueprint or a plan, he's only harming himself. And that's why I think Christians have the greatest amount of freedom in natural science, because we're not taking anything away. And I'm willing to consider any evolutionary mechanism that someone puts in front of me. Just show me if it works. Just show me the evidence. I'm open to persuasion.